Hey everyone, Chat Sematary is back, as is Katie Schaefer. Today we are discussing Stephen King's 1995 novel, Rose Madder. It does have some ties into the Dark Tower series, and Katie, I know this is kind of one of his shorter books, but it's still one that can be a little tough to get through.
Yeah, it's got some really harsh content, especially around domestic abuse and male violence against women. So, I mean, for me, it was hard to get through at times because of those reasons. But it is definitely one of the smaller of his novels.
Yeah, so let's just go ahead and jump right into the characters because there are a lot of moving pieces in this book, but really only a handful of characters who play crucial roles, and the first two being Rose's husband and obviously then her. So he is the reason she is leaving and sort of trying to start this new life because he's abusive, because he is just horrible all around. I was actually doing a reading group thing on Instagram with some other people, and the hashtag was Norman Daniels is a dick, which is something that, the creator of the read along was like, you'll understand. And you quickly understand why she chose that hashtag. That was pretty cool. And, you also have later on Anna Stevenson and Bill Steiner, who play critical roles in Rose's life in different ways. So really everything centers around Rose Daniels. And then you have this painting that also comes into play kind of as a character, which is how you get the Rose Madder name for the title of this book. But what did you think of the characters overall? Did you think that keeping this sort of a small set of characters helped the story?
Yes. I think the way that this book works is because of how close it gets you to these characters. And if you spread it out too much, then you're not going to be able to get in depth with each one of them. That's really important. And I mean, of course, the most important being Rose, and then Norman, and then probably, the women at the domestic violence shelter that she's staying at, and spreading out from there. But I think it was very important that we really get a deep understanding of who Rose is and who Norman is, and how their relationship is, and Rose, especially Rose's attempts to break away from it, why it's so important, and really grasp our interest. And I think he does a good job of it. I mean, Rose in particular is such a likable character and very sympathetic. And I think she also feels very real. I think there's a lot of, as someone who's experienced domestic violence, like, I think that everything that she goes through feels very normal to me. Like, these are the normal reactions one has to those kinds of experiences. And then Norman, well, he's a bit of a caricature, especially for Stephen King, who's really great at making us understand and sympathize with the villains in his stories, like Jack from The Shining in particular. I think in this one, he's like, there's no good side to Norman. There's no relatableness. He is just a violent asshole. But it works in this story, I think.
It really does. And then you have that contrast between Norman and Bill that we sort of figure out as the story goes along, because Rose leaves and it's not like she meets Bill right away. She goes to the daughters and sisters shelter. She meets Anna. She meets Gert. She meets all of these other women who are either staying there or taking part in helping the women who are staying there. So you have all of these characters that she meets before Bill. So she does have a little time to unwind from everything that happened with Norman, but she's still sort of in that panic mode because she knows that Norman's a cop. She knows he has the resources to find her, and she's been very careful because she has heard some of the things that Norman and his cop buddies have said over the years just from being in the house. And so she is trying to outsmart a guy who knows everything about getting away with crimes. So it's one of those things where you're kind of like, okay, you're rooting for Rose the entire time, but then once she meets Bill, you're rooting for both of them because Bill is so unlike Norman that you get this feeling that Rose is finally going to have something normal in her life. And you have Norman going on this rampage later on in the book, which they do a nice job of building up to that as well. Stephen King does, that is, with the way he wrote each of the characters. You spend a little time with each of them at just the right moments to get to know them, like when you spend more time with Anna and kind of see her background through Norman finding out about it. And you don't necessarily have to have all of the characters present in the scene to learn something about them.
Right. I agree. And I think this is probably one of King's best at, so far anyway, at putting you in whoever is narrating the story's shoes. Like, in particular with Norman, like when it's Norman's turn to talk, he is just this hateful, violent person who describes, he's very racist and very homophobic, and how he talks about just the people he even sees on the street is difficult to read because of how hateful he is. But then from Rose's perspective, we see like Anna in particular, how she describes Anna. And then much later on in the book, we get to see things from Anna's perspective, and it kind of fits in with what Rose had said, but we get a deeper understanding of why Anna does those things and who she is as a person that made her act that way. So it's very interesting how each of these characters reflects all the others in their own thoughts and descriptions. And then it just feels very naturalistic with how well he tells these stories, and how much character work went into this, and how the whole story is built based on that character work, and how all of these characters see each other.
Right. You also have the fact that Rose has the opportunity to find out about all of these different things that she likes. First she gets the apartment and gets a job as a housekeeper, but then she goes on to do, some reading of books, and basically, I guess it would be normal audiobooks for them at the time, sort of thing.
Right.
And her employer is so supportive of her and what she's good at. And even though Rose is still going through this transition period, she's finding that there are so many things that she couldn't do because of how much Norman was holding her back. And that comes to life even more when she meets Bill and they go out a few times. You can see that she's cautious for good reason, but Bill really isn't anything like Norman. And then you have all of these other circumstances where she's trying to balance her work with wanting to go out with Bill, with not wanting Norman to find her. And then once she gets the painting, you sort of have this kind of eerie feeling the entire time, because she sees that the painting changes. So there's something extra going on, but I do want to dive into that a little more here, because I think this is where the Dark Tower ties come in, because it's really like the painting is a portal to this other dimension almost.
Right. And Ka comes into things, and it feels very Dark Tower when she's in that world. So the painting is really the heart of the supernatural stuff that's going on in this book. Otherwise, It's all very much in the real world.
Yes.
And at first, I wasn't really sure how to feel about that. I was like, what is this? This doesn't feel of a piece of it. And then as things continue, it winds into it really well. There's also a lot of Greek mythology going on in here. Considering we read Insomnia, he must have had like a flashback to his childhood reading Greek stories or something, because there's a lot of it in here.
Yeah, again, something that still kind of goes over my head for the most part.
Yeah, the Cretan myth of the Minotaur and all of that. Like it was very interesting to see it woven together. And I thought it plays out really well, and it plays out very much like a Greek myth during the scene or the scenes where she is actually going into the painting the first time to get the baby.
Yeah.
That I was like, well, this is just a nice little self-contained short story here. Because it doesn't really feel like it has anything to do with the rest of the book.
Right.
Until the end.
Yeah.
Then we get to the
ending.
end of that story. Oh my God. Like, woo! And you knew it's coming. Like, obviously, if you've read any Stephen King or many books at all, like you see, okay, well, here's the gun sitting on the mantelpiece that's going to have to come back into it at some point.
And you know that Stephen King stories aren't going to wrap up in a nice little bow for you either. There's always going to be some sense of a happy ending, but there's kind of this twist to it all. You know, even with books like Christine, they think they've gotten rid of the car and things are going to be fine, but then you get this one little thing and you're like, oh man, are you kidding me?
Yep. Yep. And this is very much that. And I'm sure we'll talk about the ending, but like, I think I can see why, because I've looked online and it looks like this was not a very well received book, which on some levels I can understand. Like during the time when it was published, it was weird.
Right.
You know, this is kind of one of his weirder books, and mostly because of the all the aspects with the painting, I think. If he had chosen to just have this be like a straight novel, I think it probably would have been much better received, because he's really good at spinning like the everyday horror of domestic violence,
Yeah.
and the fear and anxiety that Rose and all the women at Daughters and Sisters are going through, and also being very sympathetic to why they're going through that and making it feel like, well, this is a thing that this is a reasonable reaction to what they've experienced. But yeah, this just takes it in a whole weird, different level. And I'm not quite sure as much how this one plays into the Dark Tower, but it feels, like I said, very much part of the Dark Tower once she's in the painting.
Yeah, it's almost like he took a little excerpt out of a Dark Tower story and put it into this story. And that's not to say that I didn't like this story, because I did really love what he did with the characters. And even though some of the stuff went over my head with the Dark Tower tie-ins, the Greek mythology, and all of that aspect of it, I was still intrigued enough with how it ended to be like, okay, I need to know if this plays in to the Dark Tower in any way. And obviously, with the way I'm doing this podcast, which is chronologically, it'll be a while, because he had some big gaps between Dark Tower books. And, you know, reading Insomnia and then going into this, part of me was kind of like, okay, I see why he did this with these stories, but I'm not entirely sure if it benefited the stories overall. You know, like you said, you could have taken out this supernatural aspect and you would have had this great story about a very serious and a very real topic, but then you kind of throw in this supernatural element and it's like, okay, well, we can relate to a certain extent as, you know, a general population knowing about this topic and for those who have experienced it, but then you throw in this one thing and you're like, okay, what purpose does this serve? And like I said, I still really enjoyed the story, but it's one of those things where, because it feels like these weren't really marketed as Dark Tower tie-ins, you're kind of like, okay, what are you getting out of here?
Yes. Yes. And at the time, like that whole concept in the like mid 90s, like the whole concept of having like tie-in materials was not outside of things like, you know, Star Wars and Star Trek and like very strong genre properties.
Comic books, you know, those things.
Yep. Like having tie-ins was kind of new in regards to how Stephen King was doing it. And I think at the time, I think it was more like, oh, these are just tidbits for the fans, you know, just, oh, you know, just like a little drop, like how in it, the guy from The Shining is mentioned just briefly.
Yeah.
Super briefly, the cook. No, I can't remember.
Dick Halloran?
Yes, thank you. He's mentioned in the Black Spot incident.
Oh, yeah.
But King is not doing that. He is laying little stepping stones for the Dark Tower series in these books that will come back later. And just as reading these stories now, like we're talking about, you know, like this part doesn't really feel necessarily like it goes with the novel that it's in. It will inform you as a Dark Tower reader what's going on. And if you haven't read it, then when you're reading the Dark Tower, you'll kind of be like, what am I supposed to get out of this again? You know? So I think it's very interesting literary experiment that he's doing in this, but it's also, I'm like you said, I'm not sure how much it serves the book versus serving his overarching goal of telling a one story of the Dark Tower through all of these different books.
Plus you have the fact that if you're not marketing it as a Dark Tower tie-in, people might pick it up not having read anything from the Dark Tower and then be confused by it. So
Yes.
that's why I find it interesting that there are all these Dark Tower adjacent novels that aren't really listed as Dark Tower adjacent novels, because we've read, what, 3 or 4 of them now, between The Eyes of the Dragon, Insomnia, this, and maybe one other that I'm forgetting or spacing on. But there's been at least 3 that I had no idea were part of that mythology in King's storytelling at all. And it's interesting because the Dark Tower is such a popular series. Maybe it's not the Lord of the Rings or something in that fantasy realm where that there are a limited number of books that go with Lord of the Rings, because there are, 3 of them? And, The
Yes.
Hobbit, if you want to include that.
Yes, and then a bunch of side stuff like the Silmarillion that Tolkien wrote, and then stuff his son adapted from his dad's writings. But all of that is not necessary to
Right.
read The Lord of the Rings and understand it. And you don't even have to read The Hobbit. Like,
True.
you can just read Lord of the Rings and you're fine. Whereas I don't think that's the case with the Dark Tower. I think you will miss out on vital bits of information if you haven't read those other books of King's Raw, you know?
Yeah. Well, to bring it back to Rose Madder a little more here, what did you think of the overall pacing of the story? Because, like we mentioned earlier, this is a shorter book of his. I believe it's on average around 430 pages, depending on which copy you have, if you have a hardcover or paperback or whatever. And when a lot of his books tend to run well over 500 pages, to us, that is short. So, what did you think of how much story he was able to put into this book?
I think he really kicks the pace into gear with this one, like accepting the scenes where she goes into the painting. Those are very much separate, and the pacing feels like almost like a different story is being placed in there, and we're kind of starting over when she first goes into the painting. But from the parts that are taking place in the real world, it's pretty fast. The very beginning is her leaving, and then we don't have any real back or flashbacks. We don't have any scenes that really hold up the forward momentum. And I would say the last third of the book, the third act of the book, is incredibly fast paced. Like, the last day when Norman decides he is going to find Rose and kill her today, which I think it's the Friday or whatever, Stephen King just like the full throttle. We are going. Everything is going to happen right now.
Yeah, and I love that, because it's not to say that I think a lot of his books have a ton of filler in them, but you can definitely tell that some of them could be edited down even a little more. And obviously, he isn't publishing books without having an editor look over them or anything. It's very clear when he writes introductions to his short story collections, or, he writes introductions after the fact to some of his novels, that there is a process for all of his books, and that has not changed pretty much. But I think an editor is willing to give him a little more leeway most of the time, because he is Stephen King, and because it's proven that his super long novels will still sell a ton of copies. So this one really felt like a lean book as far as the content goes, because you really get into it, like you said, right away. You see what happens to Rose that causes her to want to leave. You see her figuring out a plan to leave, then she leaves. It's not like you're getting tens of years of Rose's history. You just need really 1 or 2 events to catch you up to speed, be like, this is where she's at in her life, and this is where she's going to go. And he does that so well that it makes the rest of the story fly by too. And I know we both mentioned that this is tough to read at times, but it's still a pretty quick read if you can handle, these horrible things and reading about them in a short period of time.
Yeah. I think he sets the stage and the precedent for what her relationship has been like with the scene where Norman makes her miscarriage. That's just this scene of horrific violence, and it sets the tone for like, these are the stakes. of what is coming. And you kind of know from that scene on that the final confrontation is going to be between Norman and Rose, and the stakes are he's going to kill her
Yeah.
if she doesn't kill him, like, because of how intense that first scene is. And then she stays with him for like another few years, I think, after that. And knowing that going in means that I think the book kind of has to be fast paced. Otherwise, it's going to drag a lot. And it really only did for me during the scenes where she's in the painting. And that was kind of only in the beginning.
Yeah.
When I'm wondering, like, what the hell is happening here? Why is this here? And then once she gets told, like, I need you to go rescue this baby, and she leaves, then it was like, oh, okay, this does have something to do with things. And it was interesting. But yeah, he really knocked it out of the park in regards to the pace in this one, just because of how intense he sets those initial stakes.
What do you think about the fact that she changes up her look and, Norman walks right by her, essentially, and he only sees the back of her, though, and he makes this comment about how that woman looks, thinking that Rose could never look like that.
That was one of the more brilliant examples of showing the mindset of an abuser.
Mm-hmm.
And he does that throughout the whole book with Norman, in how well he has Norman, like when he tries to get into Rose's head throughout the book, he always just misses it. Like his idea of who Rose is so set in stone that he can't imagine her being any other way. And in the beginning of the book, he does guess right.
Uh-huh.
Like when he, goes on the trip that he knows that Rose took, like he does guess a lot of the things that she did. But then as they get further and further away from that and Rose changes more and more, she becomes someone who Norman couldn't possibly know, because he wouldn't allow for that kind of person to exist. And that is just done so well. And I could see so many like, oh yeah, that's what they do. That's how it is. That is what, people who abuse others, that's the why they do it, because they have to control everything around them. And when things are out of their control, they can't even countenance it. And it's so great to see Rose, who in the beginning of the book is so very much stuck in, this is what Norman expects of me, and this is the world I have to live in, and I can't get outside of this box. And then she becomes herself. She finds who she is and really owns it, especially at the end of the book. And it is very rewarding, I think, as a reader and as a woman. And, it was very much a yes. It was so nice to watch.
Because Norman had such a strict set of rules for Rose to follow and was so abusive, he just figures, okay, I made her this person. This is who she's always going to be. He doesn't really think about the fact that Rose is going to be able to think for herself and figure things out in a way that Norman wouldn't think of, because he just assumes she's not going to change into becoming her own person, which she never really had a chance to do while she was with him. So he kind of, in a way, outsmarts himself, because he thinks he's so smart that, this woman he's known for so long and has been married to for so long has no idea how to do anything for herself other than be a wife.
His wife. Be the person that he's designed her to be.
Right.
And that's very insidious in the storytelling. It's a great way to tell it, because then you get to see how Rose is breaking away from that conditioning. And it shows very viscerally how much damage that relationship did to her, because of how boxed in it kept her. And now she is making decisions for herself, and she has a really hard time doing that. Like in the beginning of the book, she's just lost because she spent so much of her life being controlled that now she has to do it all herself. And that's very intimidating when you live that kind of life.
Absolutely. And you have Anna helping her, you have Gert helping her, and Bill making her realize that not all men are going to control every moment of every day for her. Bill lets her do the things that she wants to do. They go out and he makes sure that she's having a good time, not that it's all her doing it for him. And I think that is something that really changes her perspective, even if it is slowly throughout the story. I think that is something that she knew was going to take time to get used to, having this freedom and being able to go out when she wants, to do what she wants with who she wants. And you really get a sense that she is still sort of shielding herself from her feelings.
Yeah.
But then you finally see her starting to open up more and more as the story goes on. And I think that was nicely done as well, because it's not something that is going to be instant when she gets away from Norman. She's not going to be all excited that she has this freedom. She's not going to know what to do with that freedom. So you see this struggle within, and then you have everything with the painting that comes in, and then that's a whole different struggle by the end of the book. And,
Yeah.
I think if we don't have anything else to say about the story in general, we can definitely go into the ending now if you're ready.
Oh, no, I did want to say that I think the most powerful thing that King does with Bill is that he has Bill giving space to Rose to say no and to respect that, and doesn't push her boundaries. And I think that's the most powerful thing that affects her, and his willingness to give her space to tell her own story and be accepting that she's telling the truth.
She's not just property to Bill.
Right. She's a person, and he's interested in the person, not in possession. And I think that's just really, really well done. But yeah, let's talk about that ending, because I can see how that ending is real divisive.
Yeah, what did you think about the sort of kill or be killed situation within the painting that then sort of changes Rose for better or worse?
Oh, I was real torn about it in some ways. Like, it felt like we've talked about, it feels kind of like there's two stories going on. There's the one in the real world and there's the one in the painting. The part that takes place in the painting feels like a very good other half of her first experience in the painting. Like, she buys into the mythology and the world right away once she's back there. And she uses the setup that we have with how this new world works to kill Norman, or to bring him so that the woman in the painting can kill Norman. And on that aspect, it works really well. Like, it is very Greek mythology, very, she has to give up something in order to win, despite the woman telling her, like, oh, well, I will, you just do this one thing for me, and then I'll take care of something for you. And it's like, well, yeah, but you're still going to have to pay a price in order to do that. And I'm not sure that price at the end, like, I understood why he did it. So I think the very end of the book, after Norman is dead, but she's starting to have those rage attacks, and can't control herself, like, on a certain level, that is a normal reaction to abuse. You get angry. You get so goddamn angry. And when it's been going on that long, that is something that's going to affect you for the rest of your life. And you are going to have to learn to deal with that rage of suppressed emotion. And to tie it back into the story, has some very interesting metaphorical ideas behind it, that she has to, plant this tree and then go and watch it grow and take care of it. Like, that's very much a metaphorical example of therapy and learning to recognize that pain within yourself, and that you can't just bury it. You have to take care of it and understand what you're going through every day, and so I think it works on that level. But from the story aspect, it's very much like, what? So she buries a seed and grows a tree, but how does the tree grow in our world? Like, if you look at it on any level other than metaphorical, it kind of falls apart for me. How did it work for you with that part of it?
Well, as far as the rage part goes, that was a very similar ending to The Mangler, which I found very odd because in The Mangler, you have Robert Englund playing this character who owns a giant sort of laundry service, and there's this giant laundry machine that comes to life and kills people, and his niece works for him. And then when he dies, the niece sort of takes over his personality traits. And that was very much what this ending felt like to me. So it's kind of an ending that he has reused in a sense, but then you have, like you said, the planting of the tree and the seed is growing, and you're just kind of like, what is going on? And I understood the rage part of it, but the rest was a little weird for me. I was like, okay, she gets her life, but doesn't get it in the way she wants. And given everything she's gone through, that feels extremely unfair. It's like,
Yes.
we understand why Rose has this rage now, but you kind of wish this is the one Stephen King story that would have had that happy ending.
Yes, you do, because it's so painful and she goes through so much, and because it's such a real situation. This isn't, Pennywise the clown. This is something that women go through on a regular basis every day. And of course, men and non-binary folks as well. But this is very much a historical representation of something women go through. And it's hard to read. And you always wish that the women who do go through it, like, they don't have to have that unhappy ending, that they can find that Bill who loves them and cares about them and all of that, and have their baby that they want and live happily ever after. But I mean, that's not how it ever goes in real life. Like, you never don't have emotional and psychic repercussions from going through those experiences. It's just the way humans are. But this is, I agree, one of those stories that I would have really loved to just be like, oh, close the book and be like, well, that was really nice. But no.
It's Stephen King, so we shouldn't set our expectations too high on happy endings, but you have this story that culminates in this final action that changes Rose for the rest of her life, and I do like that part of it too, because you can't expect Rose to kill someone, even if it is someone who has treated her so poorly the entire time they've been together, and have it not affect her in some way. It's just he does it in this sort of more supernatural way that I feel like it almost takes away from the ending a little bit, but not so much to the point where I was upset with the whole thing after the fact. I was like, all right, we know this ties into the Dark Tower series now somehow, so maybe this ending will come into play later. If it doesn't, I will be a little disappointed, but it's not going to change the fact that the rest of this story was done so well. And you have this sense that Stephen King is taking a chance with this story too, given that it was released in the mid-90s, and I feel like domestic abuse is something that wasn't talked about quite as much during that time period. I think you were sort of starting to get to that point, but it still took a while after that.
Right. Places like Daughters and Sisters, which definitely existed at that time, like how people reacted in the book to that is definitely like was the prevailing thought of the time, that they're, as it's said in the book, that they're dykes who steal children. And it's like, well, no, and this is definitely not, it happens in Insomnia too. She goes to a domestic violence shelter, and it's not a very well respected place. Yeah. Now, I think there is much more. I don't think we talk about domestic violence shelters with as much, distrust and vitriol as we did, 20 years ago, 25 years ago when this book was published. So there's some positive changes.
You also have the fact too that there was a time where couples just never got divorced. That was not a thing they believed in, and they weren't going to do it. I'm sure some people did, but for the most part, it seems like Norman was of a certain era where he was of the belief that your wife did not leave you. You did not get divorced. He had a final say in everything that went on in the household, and if she didn't listen to him, she was going to pay the price for it.
Right. And that if she did, like, that it was, a failing of his for letting her leave. That's very much his attitude, is that it's shameful and shows like a lack of manlyhood on his part that his wife left because whatever. I don't know. I don't understand that, but it's very prevalent in the book that like all of his cop buddies are laughing at him because his wife got away and took his bank card. And I think that was also the kind of idea that was considered normal in that time frame in the mid 90s. Now I don't know that that would be the reaction, but it certainly feels appropriate for the time frame that this book takes place in, and the area. You know, this takes place in Chicago, I think, is where it's supposed to be. And in New England, I think, is where they live. So very much middle America and a more conservative part of the country, we shall say. So it reflects the current values very well, and also is very condemning of those values. Like, King makes no bones about the fact that these kinds of thoughts are damaging to society, and particularly to the most vulnerable people in society, these women who are being abused.
Yeah, this was one of those reads that is definitely hard to get through, but once you get through it, you're like, okay, I see what you did here. I like that you tackled this subject in a way that didn't feel like it was going to be demeaning to anyone. And if people have gone through this themselves, I don't think this is a book they would necessarily be offended by. I think they might think it's a little weird because of the supernatural aspect that's added to it, but overall, I think King found this good balance of telling this kind of story, especially since, you know, he hasn't had a woman's experience of domestic abuse.
Right. It doesn't feel exploitative. It feels like this is a valid way to explore these kinds of issues. And it's not perfect with its representation of women by any means. Like, it's definitely, you can tell that a man wrote the book, but it's still a very good representation, even with those failings, because I think it's trying really hard to be a compassionate look at these experiences and state categorically that this is wrong and people who do this should be punished for their actions, because Norman is punished. Oh my, is he punished?
Unfortunately, not until after Anna is punished, and we see her demise in such a horrible way. And, you know, so Norman just kind of runs through people in this. Anna isn't the only person that he kills. And we see that through these scenes that King has written. And it really is an honest effort on his part to tell this kind of story. It's not something that you feel was done just because he was like, oh, you know, I can definitely write one of these stories. I think it was more from a compassionate perspective, like you mentioned. And you have these stories that can either go really wrong or go right, like this one did, even though you do have some of those weird things added to it. But do you have any final thoughts on this one? Anything we didn't touch on that you want to hit on real quick?
I think we covered it pretty well. I think this is kind of book that I would say it has trigger warnings all over it. Like, I was kind of reticent to read it myself, and at times it was very hard for me to read. But it also felt very cathartic by the end because of how strong Rose becomes by the end of the book. I think if you can handle it, if you can get through the first 100 pages, you'll probably be okay.
Yeah. And if you're listening to this, hopefully you have already read it, because we definitely just ruined the whole thing for you if you haven't.
Yeah, hopefully.
But Katie, thank you so much for coming on to talk about Rose Madder. You will be back shortly for The Green Mile. And to our listeners, real quick before we go, I want to let you know how you can support this podcast. You can rate and review it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you listen. You can check out our Patreon, where you can support this podcast for $1 a month or $2 a month, which will get you a Chat Sematary sticker. I am running out of them, but, you know, if enough people sign up, maybe I'll make some more. Katie has one. She can attest that they exist.
They're amazing.
And you can follow us at Chat Sematary on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. As always, thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.